First of all, I would like to thank you, Deepa, for this invitation. And I would also like to thank Prabhunath College for this opportunity. I thought I would choose two texts. One, which I think is fairly familiar, that is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. And the other is not so familiar, that is Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo's The Last of the Strong Ones. Now, both these writers, as many of you would be familiar, are from the Igbo tribal community of Nigeria. And what I have thought today is I would be presenting these two texts from the perspective of gender studies. What I want to show, in other words, is how Achebe has depicted the position of Igbo women in traditional Igbo society. He was writing in 1958. 2 years down the lane, Nigeria would become independent. He was writing about the traditional Igbo milieu of the 1880s, 1890s. In 1996, Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo goes on to write a counter-narrative of the same period from a women's perspective, and again talks about the position of women in traditional Igbo society. This is the context in which I will be presenting today. I will be showing you slides because I think that would help, particularly the students, to grasp who might not be very familiar with these two texts. So my talk is titled Patriarchal Myopia and Gendered Vision, Reading Women in Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo's The Last of the Strong Ones. Now, just to show you our two authors, on the right, you Chinua Achebe, and on the left is Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo, who is still writing. These are the two texts that I'm going to talk about. One is Chinua Achebe's very famous text, Things Fall Apart. The other is Adimora-Ezeigbo's The Last of the Strong Ones. Now, if you look at the first slide, where I talk about colonial master narratives of misreading and misinterpretation, we all know that during the colonial rule, what was happening was that the colonial administrator, who often doubled as an amateur anthropologist, took the responsibility, it was a self-styled responsibility, of writing the histories of the march. So if you got to know about any community anywhere in the margin which was under colonial rule, the perspective would inevitably be that of the colonialist. Now, this was doubled with an arrogant colonial master gaze, which was intrusive yet uncomprehending. You see, it could never really comprehend the pulsating matrix of the community being described. But colonial arrogance is colonial arrogance. So its interpretation of the other, and I use the word othered purposely, it thought was the only valid one. So in these texts, if you read these master narratives, you will find that the African has been homogenized. All Africans across Africa are homogenized as primitive collective beings. And as late as a couple of years back, Binyawanga Wainaina writes in How to Write About Africa that Africa today, even today, remains a country. It's not as if it's a composite of 56 different countries with thousands and thousands of communities and cultures. Now, in the master narrative, in the colonial master narrative, the Africans were depicted as despicable, subhuman beings, and they were located at the bottom of the race hierarchy. Obviously, they were assumed to reside in an unspeakable society which had neither ethics nor morality. And if this was the case of all Africans, no doubt the African woman occupied the status of the double negative. This is a term which I use, that is the other's other. If the African male was the other, then the African male's female was the other's other. So the African woman, you see, was consumed simultaneously by racism, which placed her at the bottom of the race hierarchy. You see, it goes like this: white man, white woman, brown man, brown woman. Then if you want yellow, yellow man, yellow woman. And at the bottom is the black man. And below that, at the rock bottom, is the African black woman. So you see, she is consumed by racism, by colonialism, by patriarchy, and literally by her depiction in the racist colonial patriarchal power discourses. Now, these are the texts that we are going to study, as I told you. Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, which was published in 1958. Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo's The Last of the Strong Ones, 1996. And for socio-anthropological authentication, I became more and more interested during my research. So I also read the works of two anthropologists, G.T. Basden, who is an early 20th century white male missionary anthropologist, and perhaps you would like to know that Achebe's father was a great friend of G.T. Basden. So these two books, Among the Igbos of Nigeria, 1921, and Niger Igbos, 1938, are gold mines on the Igbo culture. I would also like to point out another very interesting book. This is Ife Amadium's book, Contemporary. She's a contemporary Black female anthropologist, again from Nigeria. And this book is called Male Daughters, Female Husbands, Gender and Sex in an African Society. And this was published in 1987. Now, the most important question that I'm going to raise in this lecture today, and we will go through the talk and try to answer this. Why does a committed writer like Chinua Achebe, and there is no doubt about that, who chooses to write an alternative version of history, he makes it very clear that this is what he is doing. And he says that he wants to set the colonial records right. And if that is so, why does he not highlight the empowered position enjoyed by Igbo women in the traditional Igbo milieu? This is a question, which bothered me deeply as a researcher of Achebe. Now, if we look at the traditional Igbo community of Southeast Nigeria and their depiction, in these two texts, we find that Achebe and Adimora-Ezeigbo agree on certain aspects, and in certain aspects we find a silence, which is kind of it is a splitting kind of silence in case of Achebe. To begin with, if we talk about women in religion, we find that Achebe and Adimora-Ezeigbo agree in their depiction of powerful mother goddesses depicting dominating Igbo patriarchy. You'll be surprised to know, that these goddesses of the Igbo community, most of them desire neither husbands nor consorts. In fact, there is only a single goddess, Idimeri or Idimeli, and she's the daughter of the creator god Chukwu. The creator god is much like our Brahma, but she has a husband, only she has a husband, and he is called Nakwo, and he defers to her in all matters. In Things Fall Apart, we find Ani is the earth mother. The powerful oracle of the hills and the caves is called Agbala, which means woman. And Agbala is served by a priestess, a very powerful woman called Shielo. Children in this community are often named Naneka, meaning mother is supreme. A woman is always buried in her motherland. And this is what the Igbos believe, that when life is sweet, a man stays in his fatherland. But at the time of suffering, he has to go back for refuge in his motherland. If you have read Things Fall Apart, you know that Okonkwo, after his unwarranted killing of Isiudu's son, is banished to his motherland for 7 years. If we look at the position of women in politics, you see, Achebe shows his society to be democratic and republican, and it was so in general terms. If we look at it, it is governed by social consensus, but if you read the text very carefully, by adult male consensus. The Nadichi or the elders, the Igwugwu or the masked ancestral spirits who also function as reconciliatory law courts, and the titled men command respect and have a powerful voice. But he makes no mention of the presence of women in these bodies. Whereas Adimora-Ezeigbo shows Obuofo, the inner council, the most powerful politico-social governing body, to be constituted of both men and women. And you'll be surprised to know that a society which is supposed to be, primitive, within quotes, was actually a meritocracy where men and women were chosen on merit. Now, these top women representatives are Oluoda. Although a minority, they have a powerful presence. In the economy, you see, the narrative and the counter narrative match. This society was patriarchal, polygamous also. But then women enjoyed a lot of freedom. Each woman had the luxury and privacy of her own hut, and women were independent economically. You see, they mostly functioned as farmers and petty traders, and sometimes even as long distance traders. Wives were very important because they had a central place in what was an essentially agrarian economy. Men gained their authority through ritual specialization and ritual control. The creation myths and the gender ideology, they were also supportive of the gender division of labor and crops. In fact, if you look at the Igbo creation myths, you will see this beautiful, division. The growth of yam, the staple food, you see, was the prerogative of men, while the other, subsidiary crops, cocoyam, cassava, melons, beans, these were grown by women. In the family meal, yam and meat was provided by the man. The woman provided the vegetables and fish and eggs on rare occasions. If you look at the economy, you see, almost each woman had her own market stall, and she sold everything, from agricultural produce to pottery to mats to baskets. And you will be surprised to know, every time I think about it, I smile, that an Igbo woman always purchased her own luxuries. She never expected her man to buy them for her. The markets were run, policed, maintained by women. The presiding deity of the market was a woman. Cash exchange and control was a prerogative of women. And even today, if you go to a country like Ghana, for example, and go to the central market of Accra, you will find that each stall is run by a woman. You will also be surprised to know that prostitution, which is supposed to be often called the oldest profession in the world, as a phenomenon was non-existent in traditional patriarchal Igbo land. When we look at these creative professions, Achebe makes no mention of it. But Adimora-Ezeigbo shows women to be deeply involved in creative professions, be it handicrafts, painting, even professional beauticians. And in fact, you know that African women, and especially the women of the Igbo community, have a fascination for hairstyling, you know. Women were also, as a surprise, poet racontiers, chanters, storytellers, and they were much respected as cultural custodians and authentic recorders and portrayers of history. Even single women, talented single women, they could maintain their status in style. In Last of the Strong Ones, Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo talks about Shieme, the chanter, who is Oluoda. You remember, Oluoda are those who have a position in the most important body politic. She is Oluoda who showed the world that a woman's reputation does not depend on a husband. Now, in this society, there is also the custom of titles. Men, Achebe shows only men, but both men and women could take titles. They had an elaborate system of titles for men. The first four inexpensive titles, Shi, Ifajioko, and Ikwu, signaled a boy's growth to maturity. The next four titles, Ozo, Idemeli, Omalo, and Erulu, they highlighted a man's gradual climb up the Igbo hegemonic ladder. There was a fifth also, Ize. Ize actually means king, but no Igbo man had ever taken that title. You see, this is essentially more of a democratic society. And, the interesting thing about these titles was that this would be followed by a huge ceremony and a feast in which the wealth that the man had accumulated would be distributed because he will have to organize that feast in which the whole village and the neighboring villages would come and eat. So some of his wealth would be distributed. That was one thing. And the second thing was, as you took a title, a lot of social responsibility also came onto you. So, it was kind of ensuring that you did not become too powerful and too willful. As far as the Ozo title was concerned, it was a high title. And for this, the Igbo man had to invoke the goddess Idemeli, the daughter of God. And in these rituals, he had to be accompanied by his daughter. It is very interesting that Achebe makes no mention of titles for women. If you look at Adimora-Ezeigbo, or if you look at the texts, the anthropological texts of Ife Amadium, or even G.T. Baston, you will find that there were two kinds of titles for women, voluntary and involuntary. And these titles were either taken or given to very industrious and resourceful women. Now, very rich women, they could sacrifice cows and take the title, voluntary title, Ugbuifi. And the goddess Idemi, she could herself bestow the involuntary title of Ikwe on those women who were socially and economically very well placed as a result of their own hard work and unparalleled enterprise. Remember, I told you at the beginning that this is a society where merit is recognized. The most senior Ikwe titled woman, Agba Ikwe, she possessed vetoing rights in the town assembly. And though the power of the Ozo titled man could be challenged, the position of the Akba Ikwe could never be disputed. Adimora-Ezeigbo also shows Shieme the chanter taking the title Lulu. Having accumulated wealth and made a name in my profession, I became Lulu and chose the title Omesaranya. Achebe speaks of praise titles, praise songs, and praise chants only for men. In Adimora-Ezeigbo's text, however, these for women also abound. Shieme began to chant in praise of the girls. Another very interesting phenomenon, cultural phenomenon of this community is that of the age grades. Children born within stipulated 1-year periods belong to particular age groups demarcated along gender lines. Boys one group, girls one group. Now these age grades cut across political, social, economic compartmentalization and later, served as remarkable community welfare organizations. Just think, can you imagine growing up in a village with a group of your friends who are going, you do everything together from very childhood, you might be assigned certain tasks. That is, one age group might have the job of cleaning the temple or maintaining the road or whatever, and you grow all together. And at one point of time, all the positions would be accompanied by you and your group. That is, you come to power also together. So this was a remarkable institution of this community. Now I come to two very, very interesting institutions of this society. The first is that of the female husband. Now, in this culture, there is a differentiation between gender and biological sex. In most societies, you see, there is a confusion. They are brought together. But here, there is a clear demarcation. So, Igbo women could aspire to be males, not men, mind you, males, the gender associated with power, authority, and affluence. Now, this institution of female husband, it enabled resourceful Igbo women to succeed in business, and thereby they could amass wealth, titles, social prestige. And you will be surprised to know that such women could pay the bride price and buy wives to enrich their trade. The wives would operate the business in other towns, other villages. In fact, there is this reference of Nawambata Akku, the legendary female husband who was renowned for her 24 wives. In this society, unlike in most patriarchies the world over even today, husbands appreciated successful wives. In fact, that was often a condition for marriage. And though rivalries existed between successful women and their husbands, such women did not attract societal stigma. Adimora-Ezeigbo also mentions this institution, and I quote, "A powerful woman who had 3 wives in the land of Umolopia." However, we find absolutely no mention of this cultural institution in Achebe's narrative. The next institution that I would like to talk about is that of male daughters. Now, this was an institution whereby male status, that is, rights and privileges of a son, could be bestowed on married or unmarried daughters. And remember, I already explained that this was essentially a patriarchy. So, to procreate male progeny for father's lineage, the daughter of a man without a male heir could opt to stay in her patrilineage. If the man did not have a son, the daughter could stay in the paternal home. She could refuse marriage and normative family life, choose a mate, and perpetrate her father's lineage. In certain cases, the daughter could be called back from her marital home, and she would be given the status of a son, and she would inherit her father's property. Adimora-Ezeigbo speaks of this custom of Naluikuva. Aziagba, the unmarried daughter of Obiatu, chooses to remain at home and perpetuate her patrilineage. However, Achebe once again does not mention this institution. Now, marriage was very important in this community, like in most communities all over the world. But what I always think and find very interesting is the Igbo ritual of Uri, which initiated the would-be bride's long familiarization visit to her in-laws' place. This would be before the marriage. So what would happen essentially is that the would-be bride would go to the would-be groom's house and stay there for 4 weeks. You know, and both the bride, the groom's family, they would kind of familiarize themselves and see if this marriage is at all feasible or not. You see, this is how it was planned. Now the final marriage confession rite, Isa Ifi, this is also very interesting. In this, the association of daughters, it's called Umuada, we'll come to that. It questioned the bride to be in the presence of the clan head on her sexual integrity from the day of engagement. And this sentence I quote from Things Fall Apart, where she's being asked, how many men have lain with you since my brother first expressed the desire to marry you? In other words, uh, when since the date of the marriage was finalized, it is expected that there would not be any kind of sexual laxity. What happened prior that is of no consequence. The vestal status of a bride was not a prerequisite for marriage, although it was highly valued. This concept of bride price, I suppose most of you are familiar with it. This acted as a safety valve. It allowed married women the right to exercise choice through divorce and remarriage. What happened in these cases, was that if the married woman wanted to go back to her home, to her paternal home, her father would return the bride price that had been paid by the groom at her marriage. But if she chose to remarry, then the husband to be would return the bride price to the former husband. This is how it operated. In these society, the levirate system of marriage prevailed. That is, the custom of nakusi. It allowed the younger brother or sometimes the eldest son of a deceased man to inherit his wives. Both narratives agree on these issues. Now, in this, since it was polygamous and it was a patriarchy, obviously there were cases of wife battering. But you see, there was also the ground for redressal. In fact, battered women could approach the Igbo, which was a body of masked ancestral spirits, which functioned as reconciliatory law courts. They would don masks, and they would be the most competent men in the village, sometimes from the next village, who would arbitrate. And since they had a semi-divine status, their word would not really be questioned. Now, aggrieved women could also approach the all-women organizations. Achebe shows the Egwugwu trying to arbitrate disturbed marriage relations. However, he makes no mention of the all-women organizations in this context. Now I come to the most interesting part of this society, that is, this society, which, as we have seen, which was essentially a village society, a subsistence agrarian society, boasted of three very powerful all-women grassroots organizations. And I'm not talking about today, I'm talking about the pre-colonial traditional Igbo society. The first organization was the Umuoda or Umu Okpu, that is the Association of Patrilineage Daughters, which looked after the interests of daughters as opposed to wives. They were actually, they had the position of ritual specialists. And they dealt with confessions of infidelity, adultery. In other words, their job was to keep the community clean of pollutions and abominations. It curbed the excessive power, of the patrilineage wives. It was a kind of cross check. You had to ensure that the daughters didn't become too powerful or the wives didn't become too powerful. There is just one passing reference to this institute in Things Fall Apart. We saw it. Uh, but Adimora-Ezeigbo speaks at length about this institute. The next institution is that of the Alutarti or Inyomdi. This is the Association of Patrilineage Wives, and it monitored the interests of wives. And the demands of these association was very logical. They might ask for, as Amadium portrays, for the repair of dangerous roads, or sanctions on those who maltreated their wives, or on in-laws, who were cruel, or on youths who harassed young girls. In fact, I could not resist, putting in one quote from Adimora-Ezeigbo, where this man called Egwuagu, he has, driven his wife away and said that you are like, garbage, you are like litter, so I throw you out of the house. So this woman, she goes to the Alutardi, the Association of Patrilineage Wives, and cries. And so what does the association do? It organizes a very interesting form of protest. And look at it. We organized the women against Egwuagu when he unjustly drove his wife away. We descended on him like a swarm of bees with the full intent to sting sense into him. We turned ourselves into human litter, occupying every available space in his large Nagvuru. Nagvuru is home, hut. A day later, he indicated his willingness to talk with his in-laws. Can you imagine this innovative form of protest? The man who has thrown his wife out for he considers her to be garbage comes back in the evening and finds his home is full of women who are sitting silently and who tell him, when he asks that why are they sitting there, he says that you said that your wife is garbage, so we are all garbage and we have occupied your home, so you throw us all out one by one. No wonder he indicates his willingness to talk to his in-laws, you see. However, Achebe does not make even a single reference to either to Umuada or to Alutarti. This is the third most powerful organization. This was called Inyom Nanobi, or the Women's Council, and it stood for all women. The Igbo power hierarchy, it could not take any decision without its consent. And you would be surprised that all these three organizations, they not only demonstrated, they even went on strike. And these strikes were successful and also very notorious. In fact, I have mentioned two. One is that all the women in the village would refuse to cook, one form of strike. The second form of strike is all the women in the village might refuse sexual intercourse with their husbands. And the third, and I had found it very, very funny, was all the women go to their maternal homes in different villages and leave the small children back. So obviously, these modes of demonstration and strike are going to work. Now, these organizations, you see, the presence of these organizations, and I was very surprised when I was researching on Chinua Achebe. The presence of these organizations, they shatter the myth of Euro-America being the progenitor of the women's lib. Just think that the women's movement, the liberation movement, it began in the 60s, in the 70s, and we are talking of a traditional community, somewhere in Africa, the tribal community. But where in each village there are 3 such organizations. Surprisingly, these organizations find no mention in Achebe. Now, there is one more thing, and I'm gradually drawing towards the close. I would like to talk about this militant, about the militant nature of Igbo women and the Women's War of 1929. You see, in the Women's War of 1929, there were mass demonstrations by Igbo women. They were mostly peaceful, but sometimes they were violent also, and they demonstrated against the pressures being put upon them, economic and administrative, and they shook the very foundation of colonial British government in Nigeria. You know, this government was obviously essentially a male white government, and they were caught off guard. As Amadium writes, the women were rebellious and rioting all over the place with a militancy unfamiliar to white men. I mean, no white man had ever seen this kind of solidarity among women, where thousands upon thousands upon thousands of women were protesting all over the country. Now, this concept of organized female protest against exploitative structures was never a new phenomenon in Igbo land. But as Amadium says, if this was a reality for traditional Igbo societies, it was a new phenomenon in the Western world and the monopoly of the elitist few. In conclusion, I would like to state certain things. The master discourse, you see, obviously the master colonial discourse would indulge in the dirty politics of exclusion and distortion. So the position of the empowered position enjoyed by Igbo women was never highlighted. This is expected, you know. Now, this discourse would attempt to erase, you know, these the presence of these gender-friendly grassroots institutions and traditions is expected. You know, in discourse, it was erased, and in real life, because there is no discourse without ground reality, you see. And in ground reality, the colonial government, in unholy connivance with the patriarchal colonized stooges, they eroded the traditional power positions enjoyed by Igbo women. You know, during the colonial period, which would be, say, some from the 1880s, 1885 to 1960, these power positions enjoyed by women, they were gradually eroded, right? And obviously, there was no mention of these power positions in the main discourses that the majority would read. You see, nobody would really read what an anthropologist like G.T. Basden had to was writing, but everybody would read what was being written in fiction, for example, and what was being documented in the colonial archives, right? Now, this legacy of erosion of the empowered position enjoyed by Igbo women continues in our supposedly post-colonial Nigeria. This also is not a surprise. What I found very surprising and very disturbing was the very vocal feminine silences in Achebe's narrative. And this takes me back to the question that I had raised at the beginning of my lecture, that Achebe very clearly states that he is writing an insider story. And there is no doubt about it. Things Fall Apart being written in 1958 was a hallmark, you know. It was an alternative discourse. Now, if it was so, and there is no doubt that it was so, could he really afford a myopic masculine vision, that is a vision, as I have mentioned in the slide, a vision that renders women-friendly institutions and traditions invisible? Could he really afford to do that? Could he really afford to have a myopic masculine vision? Or is Achebe party to the master discourse that renders women invisible? You know, and this is the colonial compact. You know, that the assumption on both sides of the colonial divide that women are prey for appropriation, invisibility, and even erasure. You know, and this is, I mean, you can call it the colonial compact. You can also call it the border compact. You know, because patriarchy on both sides, and this is true if you look at today's concept, you know, today's context, if we look at it, in every conflict zone, in every border, you know, this is true, that there is a compact. And what is that? This is a patriarchal compact that women on both sides are prey for appropriation, invisibility, and erasure. So had Achebe signed this patriarchal compact? This is my question. Or did Achebe think that if he mentioned such women-friendly institutions, particularly the three all-women organizations that I mentioned, you know, the Association of Patrilineage Daughters, Umuada, the Association of Patrilineage Wives, Alutardi, and the Women's Council, did he think that if he portrayed such institutions, it would kind of electrify the Western audiences and maybe lead to a loss of his credibility as an author of authentic African narratives? Is that why he did not mention? We do not know, you know. At the same time, we also have to remember, as I was telling you earlier also, that it was well into the 60s of the previous century, 1960s onwards, that the women began to emerge from behind the invisible curtain in Western Europe and North America. So if he was writing about a tribal society, a traditional tribal society, and if he would highlight institutions like the all-women organizations or something like the cultural institution of the female husband, would his credibility be questioned? Would his audience believe at all what he was writing? You see, things fall apart, and this is how I conclude, and I would like you to look at the slide. Things fall apart in 1958 that sought to establish a primitive, within quotes, savage, within quotes, pagan, within quotes, culture as the progenitor of the women's live in the world would perhaps have caused a storm that even an Achebe could not withstand. And so perhaps there is no mention in Things Fall Apart, but later in Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo and in later texts, and also in the works of the different anthropologists, we find ample references to such institutions. Thank you. I'm open to your comments, questions.
Hello. Yeah, ma'am, thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Hello. Hello, am I audible?
Yes,
Hello.
yes, you are audible. Just give me a second. Hello, yes, I am audible.
Yes, ma'am. We have some
Hello?
questions. Yes, ma'am. We have some questions. Before that, I would also like to say that it was a very wonderful lecture. It's very enriching. I came to know so much about Nigeria that I did not know before. So it was a great lecture. I just learned so many things in this span of half an hour, 45 minutes or so. It's, wonderful, man. Thank you. But we have some questions that we will take. Dr. Satakshi
Yes,
from Bihar University asks you, what makes the society curb freedom and power given to women in the long run? Shall I repeat the question? What makes the society curb the
Uh-huh.
freedom and power given to women in the long run?
I mean, is this in the context of Nigeria that this question is being asked?
And the context is not clear. I mean, maybe she's asking, maybe this is a universal observation or something like that. I mean,
Yes.
what is it
Okay.
that
Okay.
actually? So, how, I mean, what she asks is very precise and direct. What do you think makes the societies curb freedom and power given to women? I mean, yeah, she is now
You see, this is
that this is a universal thing. It happens everywhere, is what she has written just right
yes,
now.
yes,
So it's not
yes,
restricted to
yes,
Nigeria.
yes, yes, yes. This, you see, this is how patriarchy is structured. If women become uh, too free, so to speak, if they every inch of space that women have today has been won after a lot of struggle, and you kind of, you are making me think about the maybe about origins of civilization. In fact, there is one school of thought which thinks that originally there might have been matriarchies, and then those were curbed, and gradually patriarchies emerge. In fact, if you look at the creation myths from different communities, if you look at the creation myths of Africa, different communities of Africa, or if you look at the dreamtime myths of the Aborigines of Australia, or if you come to our country and if you look at some of the myths of the different communities in Northeast India, it seems to portray that. Now, the point is, there has always been a kind of battle of the sexes, something which I personally do not believe in, but that is what has been happening. And so you see, if there is more power in the hands of women, it is assumed that the power in the hands of men would lessen. But that is not the idea, that is not the idea of womanism, so to speak. What I essentially believe in is not a power being taken from men to be given to women so that they can oppress men. That is not the idea. The idea is to use your power, your resources for the benefit of many. And is that really happening? This, I mean, I think this is how we should think, if that answers your question.
Ma'am, we have another question from Kumkum Rai of Ganga Singh College, JPU. She asks that isn't the custom of female husband is in conformity with male-female hierarchy? Does it actually confirm the male-female
No, it
hierarchy?
isn't, you see.
Okay.
No, it doesn't, because it gives, as I explained to you, that in this community, there was a difference between uh, gender and sex. So if a woman wanted to be a female husband, what she was trying to do is she was trying to gain the position of a male, not a man, you see. And I will just explain how it worked. It is not as if the women whom the female husband um, kind of gave the bride price and made her wife. It wasn't as if they would be restricted in their movements within the household of the female husband. It was not so. These women were allowed to take mates. They could choose their own partners, and the children born of these partnerships, they would uh, carry forward the lineage of the female husband. This is how it worked. And she would obviously choose very enterprising women. This is how it worked.
We have another question from Satyam Sholanki from Patna University. He asks, do you think that the novel is meant to be political? And it's a long question, a series of questions. I'll not go into all the details. And is the novel controversial? Do you think that the book should be censored or banned? Or should it be taught in schools? So this is what he asks. So the first part is the novel meant to be political? If so, what was the point the author was trying to make? Did he succeed? Why is the novel so controversial? Do you think the books should be censored?
See, the first thing that I would like to say is when you write, the act is political. When your writing gets published, each piece of writing is political. There should not be any confusion here. This is the first thing. The second thing is, if Achebe published Things Fall Apart in 1958, 2 years before Nigeria became independent in 1960, obviously the book was political. It was meant to be political. He stated that he wanted it to be political because he was very clearly writing from the perspective of an African, to be more specific, an Igbo Nigerian. So that is the first part. The second thing is controversial in the sense that at that point of time, yes, and Achebe was known for speaking the truth throughout his life, uh, from 1958 till 2012, every bit of writing was very, very, very hard hitting. And that is what surprised me, that if that was so, why was the women's position not really being mentioned in Things Fall Apart? Later, of course, when he goes on to write Anthills of the Savannah, the central character is a woman, and he mentions in that he would like to write a novel about the Women's War of 1929, which he never got to write. But he gradually changes his way of thinking also, maybe. And as to whether books should be banned, I think we should have more belief in the human intellect and let people choose for themselves what they would want to read and what they would not want to read. And anyway, the majority of books that get banned are banned by people and institutions who have never read those books. Unfortunately, this is the truth as I see it, And obviously, books like Achebe's Things Fall Apart or Akachi Adimora-Ezeigbo's The Last of the Strong Ones, I think it should become essential reading. And it is. Achebe's Things Fall Apart, I think, is taught in most universities across our country and in different countries of the world.
Yes, ma'am. Ma'am, we'll take one more question. It's from Mukesh Kumar from Patliputra University, Patna. He asks, do you think that Igbo women are more silent protesters than rebels? I mean, what he observes is that there is a kind of silent protest in them rather than a revolt. So this is what he asks.
No. Not at all. In fact, Igbo women are known to be very, very, very vocal. They are not at all silent protesters. In fact, the war of 1929 proves that they were very vocal in their demands against the colonial government. See, as I keep repeating, Nigeria gained independence in 1960, but 30 years before that, the women had already begun protesting against the atrocities of the colonial government. So obviously, never have Igbo women been silent. And in fact, even today, if you look at it, most of the writers from the African community in general come from this one small community in Southeast Nigeria.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your enlightening and wonderful lecture. Thank you very much. We all are very privileged to have you here with us, and this lecture was so important, and as the comments also suggest, everyone has liked it. It's awesome, man. Thank you.